To introduce Jessica Stark, she is the author of Buffalo Girl. It just came out, Savage Pageant, and 4 poetry chapbooks, including INNANET. Savage Pageant was named one of the best books of 2020 in the Boston Globe and the Hyperallergic. Her poetry has most recently appeared or is forthcoming in Best American Poetry, Poetry Society of America, the Southeast Review, Carolina Quarterly, The Boiler, Tupelo Quarterly, Glass Poetry Journal, among others. She is a poetry editor at AGNI and is an assistant professor of creative writing at the University of North Florida. She co-organizes the Dreamboat Reading Series with Dorsey Craft in Jacksonville, Florida. And Jessica will be joined in conversation by another local poet, Dorsey Craft. She is the author of Plunder, winner of the May Sarton NH Poetry Prize. Her work has received support from the Sewanee Writers Conference and the Anderson Center at Tower View, and Dorsey's poetry have appeared recently or are forthcoming in Blackbird, Cincinnati Review, Coppernickel, Poetry Northwest, and elsewhere. And she currently serves as an assistant poetry editor of AGNI and teaches composition at Creative Writing in University of North Florida. So Dorsey, I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of y'all for coming out. I'm so excited to talk with Jess a little bit about this incredible book. What we thought we'd do at the beginning here is just contextualize some of these questions by having Jess give a short reading from Buffalo Girl. If you want to take it away.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for coming. So this just came out. It's dedicated and largely about the complexity that is my mother. She immigrated to the United States in 1975 at the end of the war. And it also takes into account the Little Red Riding Hood stories and delves deeply into different versions of them. I do erasures of different versions of Little Red Riding Hood. So I'm just going to read probably about 4 poems before we launch into discussion. This is the titular poem. It's called Buffalo Girl. For my mother. History makes little bundles out of the unthinkable. Young boys carve 3-foot breasts to keep your story otherworldly and ridiculous. A crisp blade slips from view. We stand at the Albertsons customer service, and I hold my breath as you ready a well-worn trap. Discount oversight. Grave mistake. A set of eyes exhaust, and I almost feel for our opposing force who does not know the survival of ants under glass. Long after your death, you haunted soldiers' dreams. The Chinese commander that slayed you built fallacies to try and keep you still. Poor men and their fantasies of time and blood that pass only during the duration of war. Victory painted the parking lot lucky red. In every windshield, I swear I saw the glint of slow storm in your eyes. History books are forever missing the details of unfathomable loss, providing discounts on overstocked goods. You are my mother, minor warrior, who has never needed saving, who has never needed memory to make a home, a good home, alone in the woods. How are you doing today? This is kind of an intimate crowd. It's good to see you. Hey, Cav, how are you? Maybe buckle in for this one because this is a little more long-winded than my usual. It's called On Passing. For years, I tried on different stories about my body, to use the body as a rinsing husk. Language here is also a delicate pea pod, a shell that forms the world and its fantastic borders. For years, I ignored the sentence in my body, who came and who went, a blank ledger. In this body is my mother's body, who paid the fantastic price in fairy tales, mostly written by men. I have my mother's eyes and her teeth before they all fell out. I have a rare ring size around my tongue, and to some, this is monstrous. She still speaks to me in Vietnamese, knowing that my lesson stopped 9 years ago, that nobody speaks it here. But I can still say, how are you? Happy birthday. I love you. This is a sufficient rind. This is the only way I can say, let's find a way out of here. Let's take apart the woods. The discomfort that I have with my whiteness resembles the sentence in my body. A short blade, an omission, a long tooth I can't extract. The second conditional clause sets a resting stone at the head of this long-winded route. If I drank the wine, I wouldn't sleep well, so I never sleep. My whiteness makes some people comfortable. It provokes the most absurd confessions. A lot of people would like to hold me still, confess. Is there violence at the origin of each known word? I look up hybrid and arrive again to my wakefulness, afraid. The grammar of my body relies on certain conditionals. If it had never, if he hadn't asked, if the war wasn't so, if the body had refused, if they hadn't, if the first time wasn't so, if there were fewer family members, if he hadn't fled, if she hadn't wanted, if it wasn't so bad, if the Americans weren't so, if she could stay still. My mother said when I was born, she was afraid. Women born in the year of the tiger are fabled as too much in their own story. They're risk takers in this world, which typically spells feminine ruin. She laughs often at her small monster leaping again into dark. She was also afraid of the fourth scar. They said she'd be ripped apart between white walls. This country is not for the faint-hearted. I will wear it. This is the sentence in my body, decorated. I cannot not take it off. I'm here because my mother settled a debt. There is a conditional in her body. There was a conditional in her father's body, in a body of water. I am not frightened of risks, but I am afraid of drowning. I dreamed of it all year long before my son's first howl, who's running around, by the way. My mother told me to name him twice to keep away bad spirits. I named him thrice and kept him low, tried to avoid his face. The typo on his birth certificate says gone. And with this, you looked satisfied. I paced around trying to figure how to put him back in line. All night long, my bristles stood on fantastic ends. I meant to weep, but could only growl. You said nothing and brought back Panera to celebrate. Free coffee, a punch card, meal vouchers white like paper, like my powerful calves. Yaga, yaga, all tongue and tooth, how jagged I felt those weeks out. My story gone rogue. How without language, we might finally be vanished, touchless, free. Just two more for you. Against knowing, for what's his name? Against knowing, against naming too. Against notion, ruling, circumstantial love. Against symmetry, its little string leading back to the house. Against California's exclusion of diacritics. Against emptying nuance into mess, coup, root, penis, old, tau, apple, nonsense, create, against creation of an untrue gullet, against truth and reason's steady ruse. What brought you here? Who did you want? What moves you? Against nonsense as the stony lake, against useful bodies, against tonguing the wound, against knowing what keeps you still some nights, what still keeps you up on others. Really hard to read and hold this and turn the page at the same time. All right, and my last one is called Hungry Poem with Laughter Coming from an Unknown Source. And the only thing that you need to know about this poem is that it has a short allusion to the Trung sisters, which were part of Vietnamese folklore / history of ancient Vietnam. And the rumor is that they were resisting invasion from the Han forces and leading this resistance together. And when it wasn't looking so good, and it was clear that they were going to lose, instead of surrendering to the Han, the rumor goes that they clutched hands and flung themselves in a river in suicide rather than have to surrender. Hungry Poem with Laughter Coming from an Unknown Source. She's still there the further you look back. I mean, before the war and the wolves and the other war and the French and her departure and even the Chinese. I mean, that way back. And since I'm talking about my mother, let's talk a hair down, cat-eyed perfection, heels on a borrowed Vespa kind of laughter, filling whole highways with her eyeliner, another kind of laughter, and a deep belly laugh at the thought of the Trung sisters ever jumping from a single thing besides the time it takes my mother to flip the switch on a boring conversation with a dick joke. What did she say? I mean, keep up. I mean, that far back when Vietnam knew a world could be best run by women and more women with still more laughter charging the void, a still life silt, a nitty knot of a lump in the throat, that sensation between choking and uncontrollable heaving laughter at the very thing that controls you and your body and your mother's body and my sisters, my dear sisters. We always had laughter for our bodies that kept planting deeper into the woods. Ground cover. Insert cutscene. Rescind the fairy tale. We all know there are no true villains. We're just a bunch of hungry animals. I would jump with you. I would give it all for you. Laughter at sundown, laughter at the feet-crushing statuary, laughter until our very last word on this dying earth that just keeps turning and turning, its silhouette shadow figures slipping back into human skin at dawn. Thanks.
Thank you. So I wanted to start with one of the poems that you read, the poem called Against Knowing. This poem is the first poem in the collection, and it serves as a kind of proem and ars poetica, a key to the book's ideas. You've also paired that with an epigraph from the poet Justin Philip Reed. No one knows who one is, and the texture of knowing doesn't feel human. So I wanted to know what tone you were hoping to set with this epigraph and this poem right at the beginning of the collection.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. So a lot of what I wanted to embrace when I was writing and composing this was the limitations of my own field of knowing my mother, of knowing a specific story about my mother. And I wanted to resist a kind of confidence, an uncomplicated confidence that I got it right or that I completely know her. What kind of sparked this idea or this kind of perspective of my mother was when I was very young. I was snooping around in her closet and I found this small treasured notebook of black and white photographs. And it was it was like hidden from my dad. It was like in the way back of her closet. And it was all of these pictures of her and her first lover in Vietnam before she immigrated. And she just looked so glamorous and so different from how I knew her. And I felt invigorated in some ways by this piece or this part of my mother that I could never fully know. So I wanted to keep in a suspicion or a doubt of truth, of accuracy, of this idea that we ever completely know our loved ones fully. So that's kind of the tone that I wanted to set as the first poem, that this is my story. It's about her, but it's imperfect. And I wanted to preserve that suspicion.
It's just incredible to me the way that this concept comes up and up again in the book. And there are a bunch of questions that I have that sort of follow up on that. But yeah, thank you so much for that answer. I'm going to find myself saying that a lot, I'm sure. But I think of you like the way this book fits together, the way your first book fits together. I think of you as a sort of project poet. I think there are a lot of poets that the book length manuscript is sort of more of a retroactive work of curation and assembly. And with you, I feel like there's a goal of a collection from the start when you start composing. So I wanted to know what your invention process was for this book at the early stages. And if you could speak a little bit to the process of building a manuscript of poetry around so many interlocking themes.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're right on there. I'm not the kind of poet, unlike this poet I know named Dorsey Craft, who creates like perfect poems. She's very good. But she creates these like masterful, perfect little microcosm poems. They're great. She's great. You should check her out. But I've never worked like that. I don't think like that. Sometimes I'm very envious of people that can do that. But I definitely write with a large canvas in mind, with wanting multiple pieces to work in, different series, interlocking series. I love inviting the double look or the re-examination of a word and how it begins to fold and unravel across a book. And I think that's really important for how I compose my creative work. So I began this obsessed first with the Little Red Riding Hood story. I think I had some updated versions that I was reading to my young son at the time. And I just began thinking like, what a weird story. And like, it just fascinated me that we all know what the Little Red Riding Hood story is, yet we all also know that there's just so many different permutations of it, and there's so many different endings, and there's so many different renditions. So I was really interested in this concept of this very familiar thing, like my mother, that looked in another way or in a different day. It was very different and oscillating and voluminous. So I started there, and I researched and read all the different versions I could find for probably about a year and a half before I wrote anything, which is unfortunately my process is diving deeply into research. I'm a scholar by trade. My PhD was in scholarly research, and I definitely use those skills to enter into my own creative practice. It's really important for me. Rethinking archives is really important to me. And that's just kind of necessary work that I have to do before I feel good or okay with even beginning to write a poem about a subject. I didn't know I wanted to write about my mother, but then I kind of organically started to, and then the parallels between the Little Red Riding Hood, this story about this young, curious girl wandering, and my mother's wandering away from her home country, it felt very naturally in conversation with one another. And I wanted to sort of provoke that juxtaposition.
So I feel like I noticed so many of the things that you just said with the parallels between how we know fairy tales and our ways of knowing them, and how this book sort of like is pushing against that, like actively with just the way that so many different versions are erased and reconstructed. But I did want to just kind of pause and say the book calls attention to fairy tales as those known objects, both because there's like that clear moral and because we know them by heart. A lot of people, myself included, who know the story of Little Red Riding Hood might not have read any of these versions that are remixed in the collection. So I just wanted to know, could you tell us a little bit about what you learned about the story while researching the collection? And I was wondering, and you kind of spoke to this a little bit, but if your relationship with the tale has changed as a result of writing the book.
Yeah, that's a good question. As many versions as there are, what I found striking, and this is a story that predates written language. It was traded orally on trade routes. It's one of the oldest stories that's been passed down. It's highly cross-cultural. There are a few different versions that were swimming around Asia in the 17th century. So it's incredibly rich and interesting, but what's always kind of a common thread among all of them is that there's a curious girl and she has instructions and she strays, and there's some kind of punishment. Whether or not she dies, is varied. But there's always a form of punishment that comes around, which usually is in the form of her encounter with the wolf. And that's kind of where my interest came in, is wow, one of our oldest stories is about punishing a curious little girl. I was just really interested in how tenacious that lineage is, and that tenacity of this kind of girlhood victimhood, and how interesting and unfolding that is across time. Has my relationship changed with the story? I mean, of course, I can't not think about that story without thinking about my mother, without thinking about the images that I wanted to include in the book. Yeah, and without thinking about the kind of violent erasures that I purposely put in this book as a way to speak back to that archive of the curious girl, as kind of a way to speak back to it as, hey, perhaps this girl had valid desires, or perhaps this girl had a curiosity that made her special rather than punishable. Yeah.
I keep you keep answering my questions before I ask them. It's okay. I did want to stay with Little Red Riding Hood. You're just really good at interviewing. You included those full versions. If you have the book, all of the versions that she erases are in the back, which is, I think, really cool. The book itself is a sort of archive, like you said. And reading those full versions, the erasures strike me so differently. Just there were these secret stories in the stories the whole time that you sort of go and dig out. And I just wanted to know how you, and this is the part that you sort of answered a little bit, but if you wanted to tell us a little bit about how you chose erasure as the tool, as opposed to persona poems, or in addition to, some of the other ways you engage with it. How did you pick erasure as a tool for these texts? And what is the process of starting an erasure poem and completing one?
Yeah,
for you?
I think that for me, the erasure was really important to your point, thinking about how there could be another story within a story. And again, this goes back to rethinking my relationship to my mother, rethinking about the limitations of my field of knowledge about my mother, and thinking about, her stories that live in her body that I don't know and I don't have full access to, and that's okay. So the erasure form felt very organic in speaking to that, and finding a new story within this very familiar tale. Yeah.
I wish we had a PowerPoint so we could show them.
Right.
How do you get those started? When you start with you're looking at the story, how do you get that erasure process started? How do you find those phrases that are really singing?
I don't know. Just intuition, man.
Against knowing.
Yeah, against knowing, Dorsey. I can't just give you all the answers out there. Yeah, I mean, a lot of them are pretty extreme too, you know. So some of these versions are like 30 pages long, and I'll whittle it down to 10 lines, you know, that fit on a single page. So I was very indiscriminate. I was trying to be very dramatic in my cuts because I wanted to stray. I was curious. I wanted to wander from the path, from my instructions. And the appendix, which has all of the different versions of the Red Riding Hood, I forced myself, and I actually did have copyright in mind, but I forced myself to write those from memory, just from my research. So that as well is a kind of living archive. They're probably imperfect. They're probably, you know, not remembered completely accurately. But that was really important to me too. Like, this is the version that I remember by the Brothers Grimm, for example. Yeah.
That's incredible. I did not know that. You have a lot of tools like in your tool chest, basically, as a poet. One of them is erasure, another one is collage. You're also a visual artist. The poems in the collection, again, like if you're looking at it, they sort of face these visual collages that are the pictures of your mom with Jacksonville based foliage sort of spliced in. And so they complement the poems, they extend their themes, but the poems in and of themselves, I think of as collages. The erasures, but also like associative leaps, the work you do with the field of the page, and even poems that don't really fall into those categories feel like they're collaging images, they're collaging stories and characters. Characters move around and become different people in the Red Riding Hood story, which I think is cool. So, you know, kind of similar question, but with collage, what is the story of you in this medium, this method of sampling and splicing and remixing and repurposing across art forms?
Yeah, I mean, I think collage work really invites provocative juxtapositions. And again, I'm going back to my earlier point of like, I really like inviting a second glance at something that you thought was familiar. And some of it was practical, you know, like with those photographs of my mother and her first lover, like I use his images, you know. And a part of me was like, wow, it'd be pretty fucked up if I like put his actual face in there, you know? So, and I also had just moved to Jacksonville about 3 years ago. And you know that thing when you move to a new place and I was just like obsessed with the landscape. It just felt like the plants were like breathing, you know, they were just so invasive and the vines were everywhere. And it was just so different from anywhere that I had lived before. And also the subtropical climate reminded me so much of the times that I had visited Vietnam. Like I was like, wow, I told my mother on the phone, I was like, it feels like Vietnam because I had come in the summer. So I was just taking like photograph after photograph of just really boring landscape photos. So they kind of naturally bled into the collection. And I was so much thinking about woods and the concept of the woods and the Little Red Riding Hood story and wandering in the woods and doing a lot of wandering myself. So they very kind of naturally coalesced with this other archive, my mother's personal archive of her first lover.
Once again, the woods, like, you know, as I literally have written here, the woods are a crucial space. And you know, that it's an overdetermined signifier in the collection. It represents all these different things. It carries all this weight. And I was going to ask, and you kind of already did, if you could speak a little bit to how it was selecting the images that were going to kind of stand for that really important concept. They carry so much weight in the collection. And what were some of the physical spaces in the city and the area that you explored finding these shots? How did they make you feel? You already just said. And were the images sort of did the images follow the poems or vice versa, or was there like back and forth there?
I think I did all of the images after the fact. Yeah. And I used images in my first book as well. And I also used those after the fact. But you know, I want to play with these images as forms of poems. Like how could you read, you know, this as a poem? To speak to your other question, the Arboretum, Treaty Oaks Park, and then just like random foliage around my house. Made it in here. I believe this is from Treaty Oaks Park, is the image in his face. But yeah, the woods, I mean, the concept of the woods is fascinating to me, thinking about like 19th century literature, but it's always kind of like this place of obscurity, of protection in some ways, but also of danger, of threat, of right, of occlusion, of wandering in a meditative sense. Yeah, so I was kind of interested in that kind of strange tension between a place of protection and a place of deep danger. Yeah.
I feel like the images convey that so incredibly well. I feel like whenever
Thank you.
when I read the book, I get stuck on them. It's incredible. But the collection does do, again, I'm just like referring to all these very physical things that are happening on the page because it's such a like concrete book in so many ways. The collection does range in that subject matter, but it also has different forms, different tones. And this is like sort of, if people are poets in the audience, this is a real like deep cut craft question. How do you control the speed of a poem? So you read Hungry Poem, Laughter Coming from an Unknown Source, which feels really quicker. And you even have that line in there that says, I mean, keep up. And then like it keeps tumbling. You know, whereas the Erasures or On Passing, which you also read, are much more modulated in their pace. And I was wondering if you could talk about how you pace poems, how you think about that on the page.
Yeah, I mean, I know I wanted to vary it quite a bit. And I'll just speak to the Hungry Poem because that's a real specific one. And it looks like this on the page. The original version actually fit on a single page, but because of the dimensions of the book, they cut it up, and I was fine with that. But this one really specifically, like I wanted to evoke almost the feeling of overwhelm, you know, like the lines were kind of spilling over. I wanted it to be like a thick poem that you kind of had to almost rush through at parts. And I wanted it to feel kind of claustrophobic. In the sense of, you know, provoking that sensation between choking and uncontrollable laughter. So for me, that kind of making it a thick poem in form felt natural to me. But again, it's just intuition and On Passing, it looks very different. It's sectioned. It's much more prose-like in a lot of ways, but there's a lot of white space in there as well. But there's just a lot of breakage within the On Passing poem in contrast. I feel like those are kind of diametrically opposed in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Definitely. You have a lot of that sort of what I would call organic forms. You don't do a ton of sonnets or sestinas or villanelles and stuff like that. And this is maybe straying too much from the book, but I was wondering, you know, and this is something that you and I have never really talked about too much, but what's your kind of relationship with form? Would you say you kind of have a preference for those organic forms? Do you try the receiveds ever?
Not much.
Yeah,
not much with the received forms. Like, all respect. Sonnet's having a little moment right now, you know, it really is. But no, that's never been interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's probably because
is it because you didn't do an MFA?
I think so. I think so. Yeah, because I wasn't.
No one made you do it.
Nobody made me do these forms. Yes, I mean, you know, they're fun as experiments.
Yeah.
I've definitely dabbled with them.
Yeah.
But for me, they're much more restrictive than liberating. And yeah, and again, it doesn't mean that I don't pay attention to things like musicality, lyricism, structures within these kind of more open forms. But yeah, I feel for me personally, they're always felt a little more restricting than liberating.
You know, there are lots of really bold things about this book, and I think there's like a lot of pressure when you're assembling a collection to have it be this like perfect little like, and how I am showing my formal variants by choosing a received form. And like you know, this book, it boldly goes, it has its own form, it has its, you know, it works with the field of the page in these really stunning ways. And I don't think it misses the received forms at all. If that's does that make sense?
Great.
But I that's pretty much my like meaty questions. I just wanted to thank you for the incredible answers and the gift of this rich, just resonant collection. And ask you one last thing, which is, could you tell us a little bit about what you're working on right now?
Sure. Although it's been a little bit stalled since I've had several dozens of personal calamities lately, but I'm working on a book called Antoinette, which is kind of about the slippage of Marie Antoinette and internet subjectivity as a woman. Doing a lot of research. I'm in the research stage. I've just read a terribly boring biography about Marie Antoinette. So boring, but it's necessary. It's necessary work.
How is it boring?
It was so dull. I barely finished it. It was tedious, but it's good work, you know. I'll get there.
Audiobooks.
Yeah.
Oh, is it cheating? Okay. How are we doing? How are we doing on time? Do we have questions from the audience? This one says, in writing this collection about your mother, were you experiencing it as a form of ancestral healing? Did it result in a new understanding of her, of you, of mothers and daughters?
Who asked that question? No one else did this. Get out. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, yes, absolutely. It you know, it made me think very deeply for a suspended amount of time about how much I didn't know about her, you know, and about what she was like before she had children, what she was like before she traveled to the United States, what she was like in her mother tongue, you know, which was always somewhat limited to me because I had never got to fluency. So in that way, absolutely. Right. And I talk about my grandfather as well, who didn't speak a lick of English. So I had a very occluded relationship with him as well. And but I knew him so well in a lot of ways. He had a very big personality. He was like a gambling and sex addict, but he was an incredibly rich and interesting person, complicated and flawed. But yeah, I think in a lot of ways, writing it was an honoring to my mother and her presence and her being, as well as my whole lineage, especially on my Vietnamese side. So yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't not think more deeply about my ties to them, what I've inherited, and maybe what's been left out. Thank you for that question.
Were there any differences in your approach to writing Buffalo Girl in comparison to Savage Pageant, considering the research that went into both?
Great. Yeah. Okay. Who asked that question? I'd like to. Sorry, am I not supposed to ask who asked the question?
I feel like it was Sarah Stefan. No. Okay.
Oh, Sarah. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Very different in some ways. But you know, the research part was similar. So I researched for the first book for about a year. And then I became pregnant with my first child, and I was in my PhD program, and the job prospects were very dismal. So I was totally panicked. And I was like, and then everyone was like, you know, they give you all the mythology of like, oh, you better get what you need to do out before you become a mom, or else your brain turns off, which is not true. But I was panicked. And so I said, I'm going to finish this damn book in 9 months. and I finished it like 4 days before he was born. So in that way, my hand was forced in Savage Pageant, and I think it was good in a way because I had been researching it for so long that I needed that push. So Adrian kind of wrote it with me. I don't know where he is. He's probably dilly-dallying downstairs, but I needed that to kind of synthesize all of the information. It's a very voluminous archive. This one's a little bit Buffalo Girl, also came out very quickly, but it's a lot more personal. And I think it just took me a little bit of time to be able to write so close to my heart. Yeah. I think it took the first book in order to get, yeah. I don't like writing about myself typically. I don't know. I like to decenter myself. Maybe that's why the Little Red Riding Hood is the framework, so I can get the hell out from under myself, you know? But it's a lot more personal in that way, even though it's still research inflected, etc. Thanks for that question.
We've got a couple more from the same card, actually. Settle in. Could you briefly describe your process in making the collages? How do you choose which images went together? What to obscure and how? And then there's another one, but I'll let you answer the first one first.
Yeah. So again, privacy was one concern of mine. You know, I don't know. I don't really know this guy, but you know, I just thought privacy would be, you know, would be graceful. So that was an intention. How I collage, I don't know. Just intuition, playing around, you know, experimenting, seeing what works, what doesn't. I use Photoshop and I'm very bad at it. Every time I turn to it, it's like a new day. All of the skills I learned the day before are completely gone. I'm Googling every single step. So it's actually kind of time consuming. I'm not an expert at Photoshop. But yeah, I typically use that software in a very rudimentary way and just play around to see what feels good, you know? Yeah.
And what advice would you give to writers interested in researching and starting a project?
Chase your obsessions, even if they seem trivial or trite. Usually they're not. Yeah. I know Sarah Ann, she was my student. You have some good obsessions. Yeah. Chase those obsessions. We always have such negative connotations to obsession, but they're kind of the bread and butter of artistry.
Okay. This is I think a pretty personal one. Now that you're a mother, do you think your son will ever completely understand you?
No. You hear
Definitely
that, Adrian? And thank God. No, I'm sure he'll grow up to be, you know, a very practical person that works in information technology or something and have no interest in plumbing the depths of his mother's psyche.
He's going to Dartmouth, you know. Yeah. How does your writing process change between writing traditional poetry collection, shorter chapbooks, and scholarly writing?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
So it's asking like how you sort of shift between genres. So a longer collection, a chap, and like a scholarly article.
Right. Yeah, I'd say the chap and the longer books are, you know, just about, I kind of knew this was going to be a big book. Like I would need a lot of space until it felt complete. For my chapbooks, you know, they're a little more like, I don't want to say like loosey goosey, but they're a little more like springing from the hip, you know. I spend a lot of time editing the fuller collections, and then my scholarly work. Gosh, I haven't revisited my scholarly work in a long time, but I've quickly realized, not quickly, it took me 7 years to realize at the end of my PhD that while I do love writing scholarly work, and I love the work of research, basically, is what I realized. The actual scholarly writing is such a chore. It is so painful. And I also felt, and I wrote a 300-page scholarly dissertation that I haven't touched in 3 years. But what I realized after the completion of that is it's such a restricted medium in a lot of ways. And unlike poetry, there's certain formal moves that you just have to make, and they're extremely time consuming. And what I realized was like, wait, this is a very revelatory moment. I can do the research that I love to do, but I don't have all of these formal restrictions, and I can still make statements, and I can still bring in theory, and I can still, make connections between these abstract concepts. But it's a lot more liberated for me within the poetic medium as opposed to my scholarly work. And that's not everybody's relationship. I had a very tortured relationship to my scholarly work. So I don't really do it anymore, but I think there is some scholarly work out there that does really beautiful lyrical poetic stuff. For some reason, there's a part of my brain that can't activate that within my scholarly work. I don't know. Yeah.
Scholarly work is
different.
about knowing.
It is about
And
knowing.
poetry
Yeah.
is like, no.
I love that. Yeah. It's yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. Poetry invites kind of dwelling with that omitted space and dwelling with silence and and dwelling with the occlusion of complete knowledge.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. What inspired the connection of Red Riding Hood to your mother's and others' immigration journey?
Again, like kind of just merely the concept of a young girl wandering from instruction, and coming into danger, making difficult choices. I had started with a kind of deep dive into the story, and I couldn't not think about it in conversation with, some of the terms of my mom's immigration. Yeah.
Totally.
Gosh, how many more do we have?
Several. People are curious. Like, what interested you in poetry as a writing form above others? I feel like, maybe we talked about that with the scholarly question.
Definitely.
How about what inspires you to teach your craft, and what is your approach to inspiring others?
With a couple of students in the audience. I have said before, I don't really teach mastery. I teach curiosity. And I live by that. I want to inspire a devotion to poetry that exceeds formal restraints. I want to at the very least express an adoration of language as a form of survival, as a form of revolution, as a way of being and looking and living in this world. At least that's what I'm trying to do. Yeah.
Awesome. We have 3 on this one. So they look like some more kind of process-based questions. Do you type or write while drafting opinions? Or while drafting opinions on either? Sorry, while drafting opinions, like your Supreme Court justice. Do you type or write while drafting opinions on either is the question. Does that make sense?
Do I type or write?
Yeah. Do you
jack of all trades, writing, sometimes typing. For a chapbook, I was interested in writing a poem entirely on my phone, just because I'd never done that before, on one of those just basic notes apps, and it was about the internet anyway. So I was, interested in how that would shift the form and my language, which I think it did. I'd say mostly, I guess I type and edit in that way. Yeah. Predominantly.
Yeah. Were the picture modulations done physically or digitally? You answered that. It's Photoshop. Makes sense. And then favorite part of the research process, which is interesting.
Just finding out weird stuff,
Yeah.
finding out weird stuff in the
Yeah.
archive. I worked in an archive for several years at Duke for my PhD, and you find some weird stuff in there, There's like, they catalog anything in there.
Mhm.
But it also, that time in the archive was really important to me because it really highlighted that all of this is so subjective. I was the one that was cataloging and, organizing a lot of these archival materials and creating stories. Basically, they create cultural stories. So I think that was a catalyst for rethinking archives or rethinking what we consider to be objective, which is actually quite subjective, which bleeds into my work again and again.
This is like a fun one, I think. How's poetry doing on college campuses these days, Jessica? Are students interested in poetry classes?
I got 1 thumbs up. Sarah Ann, we got 2 thumbs up from former students. We are alive. We are well. We are thriving. Yes and no is my final answer.
We have one more. I don't see anyone dashing up with more, so I think this is the last one. As someone with multiple ethnic ancestries and a daughter of an occupied and colonized nation, have you faced any challenges in connecting to the audiences from the old country? Which I assume means Vietnam. But
can you restate it?
Can
if audiences from
like
the old
do you want
country?
me to read it or like again?
Yeah,
or
just read it one more
I was
time.
like, how would I restate it? I'm not sure. As someone with multiple ethnic ancestries and a daughter of an occupied and colonized nation, have you faced any challenges in connecting to audiences from the old country?
I mean, I don't think I have audiences in the old country. Wish I
Fair.
did.
That's fair.
Wish I did. Wish I knew you. No,
Yeah.
I don't think I have audiences in the old country.
There you go.
Maybe one day.
Maybe someday.
Thank you,
All right.
Dorsey.
Thank you. Oh, there's a hand.
Yeah. You can ask me after. Can you? Oh, that's okay. Yeah.
Oh, there was another part to this one. Can you pronounce your mother's name for the audience?
Kim Lee Ma. Yeah.
I think we're good.
Thank you so much for being here
Yeah,
and all
thank
of
you
your
so
rich
much.
questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.